So I actually have one additional honorable mention, and if I'm being honest, this probably should have been one of the top five. But essentially, the what if is, what if Jason Campbell doesn't get hurt and break his collarbone during the 2011 season? So Jason Campbell was the Raiders starting quarterback in 2011 after being traded there from Washington in 2010. So in 2010, they go 8-8 with a combination of Jason Campbell and Bruce Gradkowski. And in 2011, they start off 4-2, and there's a lot of hope and optimism around the team of them, breaking their postseason drought. Unfortunately, in week 6, Campbell breaks his collarbone on a pretty routine looking play against the Browns, and his season and basically his career with the Raiders is over. What's important is that this game is the second Raiders game after the death of Al Davis. It was about 10 days after. And here's why that's really important. So during the season, or before the season, I should say, Carson Palmer had retired from the Bengals because he was tired of playing for that organization. And he basically told them, I'm never going to step foot in that stadium again. So after Al Davis's death, Hue Jackson, the head coach, becomes the de facto GM in Oakland, and he takes advantage of this power vacuum to swing one of the worst and most one-sided trades in NFL history. So Hue gives up the first-round pick in 2012 and a conditional second-round pick in 2013 for Carson Palmer, a player that the Bengals had no intention of forcing back from retirement or bringing back because they had just drafted Andy Dalton and were doing pretty well considering. So at the time of the trade, I honestly didn't mind it too much because of how desperate I was to see the Raiders in the playoffs. But in hindsight, it was awful. It was one of the worst trades ever. The Raiders gave up a tremendous amount of draft capital for an asset or player that the Bengals didn't value and were willing to move on from. So maybe if this was a 5th or 6th or 7th round pick, it would have been more reasonable. But to give up a 1st and a 2nd is just absurd. And the only reason that the Bengals budged was because Jackson had a personal connection to Palmer, having coached him both at USC and Cincinnati. And the Bengals probably even said yes before Jackson finished his sentence because of how ridiculous the offer was. They probably heard 1st round pick and said, oh, yeah, sure. And Jackson said, no, let me throw in a 2nd as well. So basically this trade is a colossal failure because the Raiders don't end up making playoffs that year. They lose in week 17 to the Chargers. Palmer ends up going 8-16 with the Raiders and basically sulks his way out of town and gets traded to Arizona for some chump change, a 6th and a 7th. He has some good years with Arizona, makes the playoffs, makes a Pro Bowl, and then retires. The Raiders continue to suck under Palmer, take some gambles at QB with Matt Flynn and Terrell Pryor before eventually drafting Derek Carr in 2014. So this is a trifecta of what ifs. So if Campbell doesn't get hurt, they probably make the playoffs and of course don't trade for Carson Palmer, and maybe Campbell sticks around for a few years. But there's also, if Campbell gets hurt, but Hue Jackson isn't the GM because Al Davis is still alive, or they appoint somebody in the meantime, they probably roll with Kyle Bowler, who was the backup at the time, tank a little bit and draft one of these QBs in 2012. So this is a really good class in hindsight. Andrew Luck and Robert Griffin went in the 1st round. There's also Nick Foles, Russell Wilson, and Kirk Cousins. So basically the Raiders could have started a true rebuild after losing Jason Campbell and losing Al Davis, were it not for Hue Jackson taking advantage of Al Davis's death and making that terrible trade. And that, of course, means that we likely don't see Derek Carr in a Raiders jersey. Maybe the job is more desirable with a better quarterback like Nick Foles or Russell Wilson, who were better than Carson Palmer was as a Raider. And maybe we get a better head coach than Dennis Allen, and we avoid quite a few years of losing. And of course, everything is much different from there. So I know I said that was an honorable mention, but I went on for quite a bit of time here. But I do think that this was a very important moment in Raiders history, especially in recent Raiders history.